We're going to go with back to our study of the book of Revelation today, and we've been working our way through the book. What I find when we're doing something like that is that every once in a while we need to kind of come up for air, to look around and to see the big picture. It's like if you're on some kind of a trek or something, it helps every once in a while to get your bearings as to exactly where you are in the process. And so that's what I'd like to do today as we focus on our study here. We saw in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, that John saw this open window, open door in heaven, and he was summoned to heaven. And last week we were looking together at John's experience in the throne room of heaven. I would like to pick up the story there and lap over to the next section of the book a little bit this morning as we read, and then look at the structure of what we're dealing with here. So if you will, this morning, I would like us to read Revelation chapter 5, starting at verse 6, down to chapter 6, verse 4. So I'll begin with the white print, if you'll join me. John says, as he's there in the throne room of heaven, "And I saw between the throne with the four living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each one holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne, and the living creatures, and the elders, and the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. And every created thing which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and on the sea, and all things in them, I heard saying, To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and dominion forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures kept saying, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshipped. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, Come. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he broke the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature saying, Come. And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. And then the text continues with the breaking of those seals. So John has been introduced into the throne room of heaven, and as we have looked at the first part of the book of Revelation, what we have looked at first, in the first 3 chapters, is an introduction to the book, and then instructions given to John to write to the 7 churches. And so we have listed the 7 churches. That's in chapters 1, 2, and 3, as you can see at the bottom. And then we looked at, in these last couple of weeks, at chapters 4 and 5. And so we have this introduction at the beginning of the book of Revelation. And I brought some copies of the chart that we're using here, so that if you want to take one and pass it around, I think there's enough for everyone. May be helpful to have something in your hand as well as we look at this. What I'm giving you, you have, what you see on the screen here is what's also on this chart on the paper. So what we have is, in the first part of the book, a focus on the church. And I label this as the church on earth and in heaven. The church on earth in chapters 1, 2, and 3, because Jesus is sending these messages to 7 representative churches. And then in chapters 4 and 5, John is summoned into the throne room of heaven. And we've been focusing on the fact that John has been looking at God on the throne with angels and servants and so forth around the throne. And the part of the focus is the 24 elders. The 24 elders, as you study the book of Revelation, the elders are distinguished from the seraphim, the living creatures around the throne, from angels in general, from Old Testament saints, and from the 144,000 that are saints in this tribulation period that we're going to see as we move through. So it appears that the elders represent the church. The question was raised, why 24? And the answer is nobody knows for sure. Some people say there are 24 thrones because those 24 thrones represent the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel. And so you have 24, and that would represent then all of the saints of all of the ages. The issue with that I have is that the Bible tells us that the church saints are raised at the rapture, and they're glorified and brought into heaven. And that occurs, I think, in conjunction with chapter 4, verse 1. Whereas the Old Testament saints are resurrected at the time after the tribulation period. Daniel seems to say that very clearly in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And also in the book of Revelation in chapter 20, we have the resurrection of the nation of Israel that takes place with the martyred saints and so forth. So it seems to me that 24 elders represents the church saints. So the question still is, why 24? And the answer may be that there were 24 courses of priests in the Old Testament. David ordered all of the Levites into 24 groups. And those groups came to Jerusalem and ministered each for 2 weeks out of the year. And so that's what Zacharias was doing when we opened the book of Luke. Zacharias was on duty for those 2 weeks in Jerusalem. So one course of the priests would come, minister for 2 weeks, and then they would go home, and another group of priests would come from another area in Israel. So there were 24 courses of priests. And we just read in the text that we are made kingdom and priests. And so it seems to me that most likely when we deal with the 24 elders, they are representative of the 24 of the church saints. And so that's why I label it this way. You don't have to agree with me. You can be wrong if you want to, if you don't want to agree with me. At any rate, so following that, then we have been brought into the throne room, and the focus is on God at this point. And you remember, we're working, as we work with this outline, we're working from our study in which we summarized each of the chapters, and we saw where there are clear groupings. Chapters 2 and 3 clearly go together. You have the letters to the churches in that chapter. Chapters 4 and 5 go together, because very clearly the events all happen focused on the throne room, focused on God himself and on the Lamb. And so we also found, as we worked with this, that chapters 19 and 20 go together. Not maybe quite as clearly as some other areas, but we have the wedding of the Lamb in heaven, and then the king returns to the earth and conquers the kings of the earth. And then in chapter 20, we have Satan bound. This Old Testament saints are resurrected for a 1,000-year reign, and at the end of that time, Satan is released and there's a rebellion. So we also have 21 and 22, where we have a clear grouping. Both chapters describe this new Jerusalem that comes down out of heaven. So the reason for looking at this is that I want you to see that there is some symmetry to the design of the book. All right? Over here we have the church on earth and in heaven, and here we have the kingdom on earth and in heaven. We have 5 chapters, we have 4 chapters. The chapter divisions came later. So the design of the book of Revelation, there's structure to it. And understanding the structure, to me, helps to understand what's happening in the book. It's like every once in a while, if you're on a huge hike, every once in a while you come up to a peak, to a place where you can stand up and look around and you can see the area, the territory where you're hiking, and you see where you're going and where you came from. You have the perspective that's given. Well, that's what I'm trying to do today, is to help us with perspective here, all right? So we have the church on earth and in heaven. We have the kingdom on earth and in heaven. And then this middle section focuses on the tribulation period, and that's where we're going to move in over these next few weeks as we focus on that. But I don't want to lose the perspective of that. So as we came to the end of chapter 5, the focus was on the one who sits on the throne and the book in his right hand. And so that scroll or book becomes very prominent for us. John sees it sealed with 7 seals, and the Lamb comes and takes the book from the hand of the one who was sitting on the throne. And so that's where we ended then, with all of heaven rejoicing, singing, "Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals." And that's what happens starting in chapter 6, is the breaking of the seals. And so we read the scripture text this morning to see the flow, the connection. 6:1 says, "Then I saw." And so what you have is a time indicator that this follows what took place in chapter 5. So the focus of what we're going to do now as we move forward is on this middle section. And so this middle section, in my judgment, represents the 7 years that Daniel prophesied in the Old Testament. He said there would be 77s, and that after the 69th 7, Messiah would be cut off, and the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed. And then there would be a 70th 7. And this, in my judgment, is the portrayal of the 70th 7. We have seen the connection between what Daniel wrote, what Jesus said in Matthew 24. We're going back now several weeks in terms of our study. And now we're coming to the final presentation, the final revelation of what's going to happen during that 70th 7. Now, I think it's helpful as we start into this to think a little bit this morning, and I want to kind of throw it out here for us to interact with, to think about the symbols in the book of Revelation. There's an awful lot of symbols that are used, and so it's helpful for us to kind of think about this a little bit. First of all, we should look for the explanation of various symbols in the text. In chapter 1, John sees this resurrected one standing among 7 lampstands with 7 stars in his right hand. And right in the text, we had an explanation. It says, "Now as for the 7 lampstands, the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And the 7 stars in my right hand are the 7 angels of the 7 churches." So sometimes you have an explanation right in the text. And that's a place to start when you work with symbols in the book of Revelation. Right? Secondly, we should look for Old Testament explanations for some of the symbols that we encounter here in the book of Revelation. For example, the description of Jesus in chapter 1 correlates very closely to the description of the one that Daniel saw in Daniel chapter 10. Or in chapter 2, Jesus says that the church there had some who followed the teaching of Balaam. Well, if you have the teaching of Balaam, you have to go back to the Old Testament and read the story of Balaam and figure out what Balaam communicated. And what Balaam taught the people of Israel, or what he taught Moab to lay before the people of Israel, was this immoral relationship to intermarry and all that sort of thing. And so we have some that are involved in the teaching of Balaam in that church. Or we have in chapter 2, verse 20, the Jezebel who appears. Well, in order to understand Jezebel, you have to go back to the Old Testament. And Jezebel was a wife of the Samaritan king Ahab, who brought the worship of Baal into the northern kingdom of Israel. And she was an ungodly woman who was a woman of influence in the church. So there's a woman like Jezebel in the church here in chapter 2. Thirdly, I think we should interpret symbols literally unless it's impossible. When you encounter things in the text, we should take them literally. And one example that we've already looked at is the angel in the church, the angel of the church of Ephesus. Now, I would understand that to be an actual angel, an actual spirit being from heaven, unless, as in the context here, there are reasons to understand the context itself forces you to understand it differently, right? So Jesus is addressing the angel of the church at Ephesus, or the angel of the church of Smyrna, or whatever. The question would be, why would he have John write a letter to an angel when Jesus and the angel both function in this other dimension that we're talking about? And especially to criticize some of them, to critique them. He says, I have this against you. Well, does Jesus have something against this one of the spirit beings who is still serving God? What does that do to our whole understanding of angels, good angels and fallen angels and so forth? And so that forces me to think in terms of angel being rather messenger of the church, and that would be a human messenger, in my judgment. So there are places like that where you have to figure out, should I take it as a literal angel? Angel, I think the term angel is used like 82 times in the book of Revelation. So an awful lot of them literally are the spirit beings from heaven. But some of them, at least in this passage, are used in a different way. Fourth, we should understand the figures of speech in a natural, everyday way, where possible. All right? For example, Jesus says in chapter 1, verse 8, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. So Alpha and Omega is a figure of speech. It would be like us using A to Z. Alpha is the first Greek letter, Omega is the last Greek letter in the alphabet. So when he says I'm Alpha and Omega, he's saying I'm the beginning and the end. I'm the first and the last. I'm everything. Or hair white like wool, like snow. I think we should take that as being white like wool or white like snow. It's just a symbol figure that we use all the time, right? Like what?
Like us.
Like us. Okay. All right. Some of us, yes. All right. And then number 5, I would say don't force what you can't figure out. There are some figures of speech, some symbols that are used in the book of Revelation. I don't know what they mean. All right. When Jesus talks about feeding them with hidden manna, if it's hidden manna, then that seems to imply to me that we don't know what it is. And we can speculate, we can come up with different possibilities. I'm okay with not knowing every little detail. Somehow that's going to be explained as time goes on. Or a white stone in the same passage. There's a number of places when he talks about the 7-headed beast with 10 horns and so forth. There are things that we don't know precisely. Somehow it's a reflection of what's going to happen, and sometimes we just have to let it be. Maybe we gain insight along the way. Maybe at some point it's further clarified as events unfold and so on. I don't know. And then the other thing that comes up a lot is the significance of numbers in the book of Revelation. For example, the number 7 is very prominent in the book of Revelation, okay? Anybody know how many times it occurs?
Not 7.
I wouldn't expect you to. I didn't know either until I looked it up this week. All right. The number 7 occurs 55 times in the book.
Wow.
So there are 7 churches, there are 7 bowls, there are 7 plagues, there are 7 spirits of God with 7 lamps.
Is that only in Revelation?
No, 7 occurs other
throughout the
places,
whole-
but this is just in the book of Revelation,
Okay.
55 times. The number 12 is prominent. 4, 3, 10, and 24 are the most prominent numbers. Now, when you read stuff on this, some people will say these numbers are all figurative. And other people will say these numbers are all literal. It seems to me that we take everything literally unless the text forces us otherwise. Okay, when we were dealing with the angel, we would take that to be a literal angel, except that as you read what Jesus is saying to those angels, the text seems to force you to consider a different possibility. And we want to do the same thing when we look at the numbers. If he says write to 7 churches, then there are 7 churches. Now, are these 7 churches sort of representative of all the churches? I think so. But you don't have to go that way. There were 7 literal churches that Jesus wrote to. And so, as we look at the number 7, it's very prominent. So why 7? Why 7 so often? Probably the best understanding of that is the fact that 7 seems to represent a completeness, a sense of finishing or a whole from God. And it started way back at the very beginning, right? Started with the 7 days of creation. So God worked on 6 days. On the 7th day, he rested and said, it's finished, and it's perfect. So the 7th day seems to represent a completion. And as you come through the Old Testament, over and over again, the number 7 occurs. Naaman is to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River to be healed. Various places you hit this number 7. And so when we have at the very beginning of the book of Revelation, the 7 spirits of God and the 7 lamps, which are the 7 spirits of God, and so on, it seems to indicate a sense of completion that's involved there. 12 is also a number that's used fairly prominently. 12 tribes is mentioned a number of times. And so there's 144,000, there's 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. And so that's used a number of times. 10 is used a number of times. Usually 10, I think in all but one of them, refers to the kings, the horns on the heads of the beasts. And we don't know exactly what they are, except that clearly they're indicated to be kings. But we don't know who they are or how it's going to appear in the end days. And then 24 is always tied to the elders. So some of the numbers are just helpful for us in terms of seeking to understand where we are here. Questions or comments as we think about some of these things?
I think God set it up the way he did so that you definitely got to get into the Word. You have no choice to understand it if you
Good.
really. So it makes us show our dedication to him and our seriousness about knowing him.
Okay, good. All right.
I think it's amazing that Jesus took fishermen, and those fishermen are giving us things that they're giving us concepts and ideas about God that are so beyond any earthly thing. And like you were talking about the construction, I mean the construction of the whole Bible, it is so beyond what a human person would be able to conjecture. It's just, it has to be God.
I think so. Good. All right. So when we come back to then this middle section, all right, what we're going to do is embark on the study of, this is the heart of the book. There are 13 chapters here, We had 5 at the beginning, 4 at the end. So the largest single unit is this middle section. And to me, the fact that this center section has the 5 time markers that we looked at in chapters 11, 12, and 13. All right, we had Jerusalem trampled underfoot for 3.5 years. We had the 2 witnesses that ministered for 3.5 years. We have the woman who was nourished. It says twice that she's going to be nourished and protected for 3.5 years. And then we have the authority of the beast, the Antichrist, for 42 months or 3.5 years. So we have this indicator right in the middle of this 3.5 years. And you have 3 choices, as we said before, 3 choices for 3.5 years. If it's a 7-year period, the 3.5 years could be what?
Half.
It'd be half of it, yeah, but it would have to either be the first half or second half or
Somewhere in the middle.
something out of the middle, all right? So it could be something out of the middle here, like this, that would be 3.5 years. But the logic would say that it would be either the first half or the second half. If you have a 7-year period and you have 3.5 years, without some kind of indication of it being out of the middle, some specific instruction, you would think it would be the first half or second half. Now, what we know from the Old Testament is that there's going to be a positive relationship between the Antichrist and the nation of Israel initially. So it's not likely that Jerusalem is going to be trampled underfoot for the first 3.5 years. It would be more likely for that to happen in the second half. And the 2 witnesses, more likely. The woman has to be nourished. Jesus said in his treatment of this, when you see the abomination of desolation set up in the temple, then you need to flee. You need to get out of Jerusalem. You need to head out into the wilderness. Well, that's what happens with this woman. Then the analogy that's given, the symbol that's given, is a woman who flees into the wilderness where she is supernaturally protected by God for 3.5 years. So it seems like we have an announcement here about the middle point and certain things that are going to take place for the second 3.5 years. Now, we don't want to force that, but we want to be aware of the indicators that are part of the revelation that Jesus has given. So he has provided information for us in terms of us beginning to look at it. Now, the 7s come back. We have the 7 seal judgments at the beginning, and then we have 7 trumpet judgments. The 7th one is actually introduced here, actually right in here at the end of chapter 12. And the 7th one leads to the 7 bowl judgments. And then the final judgment that's described is the judgment of Babylon. And so that's a subject in itself. So we have this superstructure, if you will. We have this design to the book. And to me, it's helpful for us to consider that as we move through. So where we left off, we have Jesus coming inside this circle of the elders, coming to God on the throne, taking the book, opening the book, and all of heaven, and at the end of chapter 5, all of creation reverberates with this worship. And it's like the ripples in a pond as it starts at the center and it goes out, and starts in the center and the worship goes out as we have these ripples of worship taking place throughout all of creation as they are watching the Lamb break the seals to initiate this 70th week of Daniel and God's judgment of the nations. All right? So Father, help us as we contemplate this and as we seek to navigate this revelation with all of its symbols and its signs, the imagery that you provide. You are seeking to communicate with us in ways clearly that are best for us, but which are also difficult for us. Help us as we navigate that, I pray, as we move ahead in our study. We thank you that you have given us the picture. that you are seated on the throne, that the plan is all laid out, it's all written out, and Jesus is just following what you have decreed in the perfection of your plan. All of these sevens as you bring to completion your plan for this earth. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.